You'd be forgiven for not knowing that the 7600 XT is the exact same core as the 7600. It's fully, completely the same thing. They both have 2048 cores, 32 ray tracing units, 64 AI accelerators, and 128-bit memory bus. The only differences are that the XT gets a 100 MHz boost clock increase, at least on the reference cards, and 16 GB of GDDR6 versus 8 GB for the non-XT. That's it. For that privilege, AMD expects you to pay a full £100 more. The 7600 is around £250 right now, whereas the XT is more like £350. Now you can get cheaper XTs. In fact, this Gigabyte OC card is more like £330, but is that extra £50 to £100 actually worth it? Well, let's test them and find out. Now, I tested both at 1080p and 1440p for your viewing convenience, and starting with Starfield at 1080p, the XT enjoys a healthy lead here at 126 FPS average versus 111 FPS average on the 7600. Both of these cards are perfectly playable, of course, and this is actually a pretty stark difference considering these are otherwise identical cards. Clearly, the VRAM was useful here. At 1440p, the difference is a little more substantial, going from 109 FPS average down to 94 FPS average. You also go from 80 FPS in the 1% lows to 69, which, while is memeingly nice, isn't as smooth. Again, it's still perfectly fine, but that's a pretty decent win for the XT. Cyberpunk, on the other hand, strangely, sees literally no difference between the two, with the XT technically running slower by a shocking 0.6 FPS average, mind. It does seem to have a slightly higher 1% lows though, but only by 2 FPS. At 1440p, it's the exact same story, save for a slightly larger gap in the 1% and 0.1% lows in favour of the XT. You're going to get the same gaming experience on the XT as the 7600 in Cyberpunk, at least on medium settings. In CS2, there is equally no difference. The margin of error here is a little larger than other titles, as this is a more manual benchmark, but still, it's functionally identical. In general, CS2 is a more CPU-limited game, so it isn't too surprising two cards with identical cores perform functionally the same. This is also the same at 1440p, so I won't stay here for too long. Even the better 1% lows are present on the XT. Fortnite at 1080p is, again, the same damn thing. The averages are the same, although strangely the 1% and 0.1% lows are actually inverted, with the 7600 coming out 5 FPS ahead here. I can't say I can explain this one, although at 1440p the results swap back so the XT is faster across the board. Not by much, of course, but still. The only standout here is the 1% lows, where the XT mustered 15 FPS higher than the 7600, which is actually a noticeable difference in smoothness. It still isn't night and day, but at least there's finally something remotely tangible between these two. As for Flight Simulator, that actually has the 7600 ahead, only by an FPS or two, so pretty close, and not exactly significant enough to make any conclusions from, but still. At 1440p that flips, so the XT is a couple FPS ahead across the board. That's all pretty standard for two functionally identical cards. Hitman 3's built-in benchmarks let me break out the CPU and GPU performance, and obviously we're looking at the GPU performance here. With this level of sort of isolation, it seems like you can expect a pretty decent amount more performance out of the XT, with an extra 15 FPS on average over the 7600. That's pretty significant, although strangely the 1% lows are inverted here. Not sure what went on there, especially as the 0.1% lows are in the XT's favour. The gap seems to be consistent at 1440p as well, with a 13 FPS advantage, and this time Much more sensible 1% and not 1% low figures. As for Rainbow Six Siege, much like CS2, this is a more CPU limited game, so understandably there is functionally no difference here. The XT has a slight lead in the 1% lows, but it's so slight that it isn't worth considering. At 1440p, the XT does take a slight lead, but only by 4 FPS, and at 300 FPS average, 4 FPS is not a useful addition. Lastly, in Shadow of the Tomb Raider, I honestly expected this to be a bigger difference, but it really isn't. Just 5 FPS difference here, at least on average. The 1% and not 1% lows, though, tell a different story. I noticed this during the benchmark runs too, but the 7600 had a tiny bit of stuttering present where the XT didn't. That's reflected in the 1% and especially not 1% low figures being so drastically low in comparison. Of course, both are perfectly playable, but one is undoubtedly better. This trend continued at 1440p, where the same averages, the averages are functionally the same, but the 1% and not 1% lows tell a very different story. I'd much rather be gaming on the XT here. One potential reason for some games seeing a difference in performance, things like Hitman seeing a decent amount more performance on the GPU side, is thanks to the increased power budget that the XT gets. Of the two cards that I'm using here, the 7600 drew a maximum of 173 watts of total board power versus the XT pulling more like 200 watts instead. Now that isn't a massive difference in the grand scheme of things, and power consumption versus performance is very much non-linear, as in, say, 30% more power doesn't mean 30% more performance, but it's something to consider. One other thing to consider is that the settings that I was testing at here might not be the best for extracting the differences between the cards. Testing at low or medium settings is a lot less likely to stress, say, the VRAM. So I went back and did a couple more tests, specifically at ultra settings. Starting with Hitman, again using only the GPU data, interestingly, while the FPS is obviously lower running at higher settings versus medium, the performance gap isn't all that different. Both are around 10% faster on the XT, but the actual percentage doesn't really change much. Rainbow Six Siege doesn't change much either on the Ultra preset. Performance does go down, obviously, but the gap between the cards is functionally identical. And actually, the same goes for Cyberpunk on Ultra. There's just 2 FPS average separating the cards here. There really isn't much of a difference. With that said, I know some games will see a difference, so in the next video I'm going to take a closer look at the VRAM usage in games with these cards and see just how badly you need that extra VRAM. Because currently, it doesn't look like you have much of a problem to have 8GB and just save your cash. Of course, future-proofing is something that you might want to consider, as well as other use cases you might have, like running LLMs locally, as I demonstrated in a recent video, link in the cards, or creative workloads like video editing. If those sorts of workloads are on the cards for you, the XT makes a lot of sense. One thing I would say about the notion of buying the XT as a way to sort of future-proof your card and your purchase, there's a good chance that by the time 16GB of VRAM is 100% necessary, the hot pink bonefish core in these cards, legit, that is actually their name, like seriously, is likely to be outdated and underperforming anyway. And you'll likely want to upgrade GPUs to something more powerful outright that will likely come with more VRAM as well. With that said, the XT is a decent card, and at the right price, I think it could be worth the extra, especially for the increased stability that it seems to bring on the whole. It is also worth mentioning that I have 64GB of Crucial's 6000 megatransfer per second DDR5 in here, which means that the system RAM always had room to spare regardless of the GPU's VRAM capacity. If you only have, say, 16 gigabytes of system RAM and the 8 gigabyte card needs to spill into that system RAM, well, that might be a bad time, whereas the XT might not ever need to run into that issue. Either way, I'll link to both cards in the description and leave it to you to decide which one is best for your needs. Of course, if you also want to see more videos, including the one taking a closer look at VRAM usage and system RAM usage as well, do hit the subscribe button as that will be coming out next. Otherwise, you can check out plenty of other videos on the end cards when they pop up. You can also use a load of links in the description if you want to support me and the channel. You can pick up my own hardware, the open source response time tool and open source latency testing tool at osrtt.com. There's Amazon affiliate links and a load of other stuff in the description if you want to check that out. Otherwise, thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed it. We'll see you all in the next video.